Welcome to Foundstone Conversations. I'm Andrew Bird. And in today's episode, we're chatting with Ross Hastings, who's the Managing Director of Nilo. Welcome to the show, Ross.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to see you on a sunny spring Melbourne afternoon here in Richmond.
Beautiful day.
It certainly is. Now, just for people's context, Nilo, and Ross, you'll do it better justice than I will, but Nilo, from my perspective, is an advisory who specialises in company purpose, customer experience strategy, employee experience strategy, broader strategy and research. So have I got that kind of right, Ross?
Yeah, that's broad strokes of what we do. Ultimately, it boils down to, we're really focused on bringing the voice of customers and employees into the boardroom, basically to facilitate focused purpose and strategy.
Beautiful. I know, a lot of the stuff you're putting out there at the moment is really distilling those sorts of things down. So that was really part of what we wanted to get you on today to talk about. I mean, purpose is going to be the main topic, but then how it really relates to strategy. They're two big subjects in themselves, aren't they? And there's all sorts of definitions we hear of those two big topics. So the context is really going to be, how purpose relates to strategy, some of your definitions, and then some of the work you've been doing, some of the things you're seeing with real life clients, the broader, strategy community out there. So that's really the run of today.
Great, let's do it.
So to kick it off, from your perspective, if we start really from the foundations and the fundamentals, what simply does purpose mean to you? And then how does it really relate in a strategy context?
Okay. Well, for us, purpose is a kind of an overarching layer above strategy, which gives direction to and informs strategy, culture, and brand of a company effectively. I think a really important part about what you asked is how do we define purpose, or what do we consider purpose to be? And for me, purpose is a framework. So a purpose framework for us includes a definition or articulation of what the shared belief is in a company. So that kind of why or North Star piece is often known as, but also the vision, the mission, and the values. So those things, I believe, should come together to form a clear narrative, which we can, consider the purpose of the organization. Beautiful.
I like the term there, clear narrative, because often it's, in my experience, from seeing many organizations from vision, mission to purpose statements, they are sometimes, beautifully crafted statements, but then when you go onto the floor and start, chatting with some of the frontline staff, some of the management, and then externally to the organisation, what's your view and what's kind of look and feel does this organisation have to you? It doesn't always have a clear narrative, does it?
No, and I think traditional approaches to purpose, the early days of kind of corporate focus on the matter were significantly mishandled, in my opinion, and there's various ways that has happened, but ultimately it often came down to the fact it was an exec or board level exercise that was almost treated like a internal marketing campaign. It was crafted to be catchy, almost treated like a tagline, and then was marketed to the organization internally and sometimes externally as well. But to your point, it was often very disconnected from the reality within that organization.
Yeah, it's so true, isn't it? The kind of the PR stunt kind of campaign internally, and it's if it's done that way, as you said, historically, but it's still kind of in some organisations, unfortunately, still being done that way. Partly because people don't know any different how to approach purpose and strategy. But I think that's certainly something that we're seeing as well. And I think there's a huge opportunity to help leaders actually approach it in a bit of a different way, isn't there?
I agree, and I think there's growing realization of the shortfalls of existing purposes, visions, mission, values, manifestos, ethoses, whatever they're called. And, some of the disruption that's happened to the industry in the last couple of years, particularly with coronavirus and lockdowns, I think a lot of what we would consider purpose frameworks were put to the test then. Did they actually stand up as a tangible and pragmatic tool that gave direction to strategic decision-making? Did they build alignment of perspective on what mattered most to allow for quick and effective strategic decisions under pressure, and did it allow for those decisions to be made and then be bought into by the organization? Because these, organizations had to pivot extremely quickly, and I think the ones that had a clear purpose did a pretty good job of that. Maybe not perfect, but at least I think the sentiment was that the efforts were respected and appreciated by those attached to the organization, versus the ones that didn't have a clear purpose and just made some horrendous decisions. And in some cases, we heard of exec teams just disappearing for a week or two or three while they tried to figure out what the hell they were going to do, and just left the organization in the dark. And then, of course, we had a period of time where companies were dispersed everywhere. Everyone was working from home, and that kind of purpose piece became really important there as well from a cultural perspective. What's that thing that connects us all together when we're not in a physical space? So I think a lot of purposes were put to the test quite dramatically in the last 2 or 3 years, which has hopefully started to draw attention to the fact that they need to be this pragmatic, practical, tangible, strategic tool or layer. Back to your original point, I agree that I'm hoping that's driven awareness of how poorly it's been handled in the past.
Yeah, you'd certainly hope there's some learnings there. And like you've painted that picture, it's probably accelerated and highlighted through the last few years, as you said, off-site, people off-site and literally executives kind of disappearing, thinking, what on earth how are we going to respond to this? Probably inflection into themselves in terms of how am I personally going to adapt to it, let alone how am I going to lead. So just on that point, in terms of, I've always been intrigued when you look at purpose, I look at it, maybe incorrectly, we can have a personal purpose. And me personally, I don't have a crafted personal statement at all. And I probably couldn't, if you asked me what was my personal purpose, I'd probably struggle to say what it is.
Most people would, I think.
That's reassuring to hear. So when we look at purpose, is it right to look at it from that, what is our personal purpose? And then how does that relate to our kind of work and our professional environment? Is that a reasonable way to look at it like that?
Somewhat. I actually think that it's a misconception that there's people, to your point, that there's people wandering around with a really, articulated purpose in their hand, looking for a company whose matches. There seems to be this notion that we find an organization or an employer whose purpose matches our own, and I think that's fundamentally, let's say fundamentally rare, if not non-existent.
I hear you.
For me, purpose, again, is a clear articulation of what a company is all about, what they believe in, where they're heading, what they're doing, and how they're doing it. And what matters there is that a person can see that, and they can see it in action, and that they believe in that themselves. Doesn't need to match exactly their articulation of their purpose. They just need to buy into and emotionally connect to what that company's doing. That means that if and when they engage that organization, either as a customer or as an employee or as a shareholder or a stakeholder of some sort, they can connect their actions to a bigger picture that they connect with, which gives their actions meaning. It gives them, it means that they feel that what they're doing matters. So it just needs to not be jarring. It needs to be something that individual buys into and believes in, as opposed to being an exact match.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to put it, because that frame you put there, that there's not all these people wandering around with their CV as such, or their statement saying, where do I fit in? So does that then say that, when there's a whole heap of diverse staff in an organisation bringing their own diverse views and experiences, that I think I've heard you say before that a purpose essentially can already exist in an organisation. So it's finding out what that really is, as opposed to trying to create something.
Exactly.
So if I've got that right, you put that in the past?
Yeah, I would usually say, a purpose is clarified, not created. And this kind of connects back to what you were saying earlier as well about those kind of disconnected, polished, tagline-y type purpose statements. A purpose exists within an organization. An organization is ultimately a living, breathing system of living, breathing systems. We're all human. We're all living organisms, and we all come together in a community that is a business, and there is a reason that everybody in that company joined and is still there. And articulating that is essentially what purpose is all about. It's about going out into the organization, speaking with people, hearing what they say, and it's around those things. Why did you join the company? Why are you still here? Why is what we do? What is it that we do in your mind, and why is that important? And where do you believe the company should be going? And what are the most important things that we're doing? What are the things that we should stop doing? And how would you describe us when we're at our best? Those are the sorts of questions that, hearing at scale across an organization, start to give insight into what that company's purpose is. And the skill there is then being able to turn the volume up on that, hear all those varied and diverse voices, and be able to synthesize that down into the core and common themes that come through that. So to your point, will everyone say the same thing in the same way? No, but you usually find that there's kind of core essential themes that run through it. And that's simply then kind of a thematic analysis type approach, and having a framework and process through which to synthesize that down into a clear articulation and narrative that does that job we talked about earlier in terms of giving direction to and informing strategy, culture, and brand.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So if I kind of play devil's advocate, are there certain scenarios you come across that you're having those conversations and you're connecting, all different levels and types of staff in different roles, different departments, front, client-facing, and more internal. Are there times where you really are struggling to distill down some consistent themes? And then if that happens, does that say there's something kind of wrong here? Or normally there's some pretty clear themes that start to bubble to the surface?
There's always clear themes. Two things tend to happen when we talk about kind of a shared belief, a vision, and mission values. One of the things that often needs work through is what are the altitude of those things. So what some people might consider a mission, a strategic type statement, might be for others a kind of high level belief type statement, and vice versa.
Yes.
I hope that makes sense.
That does, yeah.
But generally speaking, there is a core, consistent, common theme, and I don't think that should come as any surprise, because if we look at any culture in the world, they're brought together by some sort of common belief, some sort of shared belief, whether we look at, sports teams and their supporters, or religions, or countries, communities, whatever it might be. They're held together by a core shared belief. And if we look at any of those communities based on that belief, there are going to be some that are more, let's say, passionate and committed and articulate about that belief, and more hardcore. And then there's going to be outliers. And then there's going to be some real outliers that end up kind of dropping out of that system because their connection to that belief isn't that strong.
Right.
So if we look at that in a company setting, the same stands. That of course there's outliers. There's people that whose voice isn't quite in line with everybody else, and I think that's where the process of narrowing that down into kind of what matters most to the bulk of who matters most to you. It should also probably be mentioned that when you engage across an organization, I'm yet to work. We generally work with mid to large companies. So I'm yet to work on a project where we get 100% participation when we go out to speak to employees, right? It just doesn't happen. The important thing is that everybody knows that they've had the opportunity to have a voice.
I see.
So of course, we are working with the insights from the people who have given their voice to the process. And we use various tools and processes to make sure that that's as easily accessible as possible, and we hear as many voices through as many different formats as we can. But of course, there always is a group that don't respond, and the hypothesis might be that there's more dissenting or misaligned voices in those groups, right? But
for sure, as you said there, as the main thing I got, one of the main things I got from the picture you painted there, as long as people are given the opportunity to voice what their view is, and they're acknowledged for that, as you say, there might be outliers, but if they're given the opportunity, and I know there's overlap with some of the work that Nilo does and Foundstone does from a strategy perspective. That's what we certainly see from a more of a pure strategy perspective. Normally the top-down approach is that, that executive saying, here's a strategy, go and deliver. But if you apply those same principles that you use from a purpose perspective of actually opening up the conversation and giving the opportunity to be acknowledged, it changes the whole dynamic from this us and them thing.
Absolutely. And the key thing that you mentioned there is, I can't remember the term you used, but basically it's closing the loop. It's going back and thanking them for their input, letting them know how their input and their insights was taken through the process. So
to me, I think I use the word acknowledgement. It's kind of a human kind of instinct, isn't it, to want to be acknowledged?
Exactly. And if we can clearly articulate how their input was considered, and if it didn't end up in the final version, why not? I think that really helps too.
It's a really good point, isn't it?
Yeah, and people that are part of that system and are connected to the bigger picture, and connected to the people around them, often if they hear that their opinion or their insight wasn't taken forward, but 90% of their peers actually believe this other thing, often that will kind of shift their perspective. If they are a kind of functioning part of that community, they'll appreciate the fact that the majority of their peers, that social proof will play out in them kind of buying into that. Of course, again, we come back to the fact that there's outliers. There are people in any organization that aren't long for that organization, and that's okay. That's part of a normal company.
Yeah, it sounds like, I suppose it's a pretty genuine way of actually just, once it's genuinely distilled down, it can probably help make people make decisions. This organisation is for me or it's not. So, totally. And you'd want to know that sooner rather than later. Well, just when you talk about the outliers, and from a strategy perspective, the principles we try to live by is, bringing those external perspectives in, right, from customers, other very seemingly unrelated industries, suppliers and customers. And that just adds to the richness of then to make, strategy choices. When we apply that to what you see in the work you do, outliers in terms of that external view, how do you see, in terms of getting, so from your customers and broader community, them connected into your broader purpose?
I think it's critical. Obviously, if you're going to have a purpose that informs your strategy, your culture, and your brand, it's really important that it considers what's important to your customers. Otherwise, you're missing a trick. Sometimes that will involve primary research with the customer, but often with the size of company we deal with, at least they have quite a lot of customer knowledge, quite a lot of customer insight. So I guess the short answer is yes. As my advice would be, you need to bring the voice of the customer into that conversation. In terms of how that's done, sometimes primary research will be required. Sometimes there's a depth of knowledge in the organization. These hefty 180-page reports that many companies are sitting on, that can be mined for the insight required. But either which way, the short answer is yes. You absolutely need that customer lens, but also really interesting to know, what other companies in your industry are doing in the purpose space. It's also really great to know what best practice is in the purpose space. What kind of shining lights and great examples are there of companies that have done purpose very well? So to your point, looking externally in many different ways it is critical. Yeah,
for sure. And I think that what you've articulated there, when you look at that broader community, you look at circular economy, and then from a risk point of view, chain of responsibility, it seems to be, community and societies are forcing organisations in a lot of cases to actually look at the chain of impact, through to from their staff. We had a recent conversation with a guest who talked about, he's a managing director of a co-working space, Brad, and talked about, he thinks about what impact is he having on his staff's broader family. So that, even that mindset is probably rarer these days, but I think if you can look at that, and I've heard I know your values in your organisation is aligned to that, looking at it, what is the broader impact on human lives? So I think that's really powerful. We talked about, you mentioned nearer the start there in terms of, not looking at purpose like a marketing piece internally or a PR stunt. And our audience, are executives who are probably struggling to a degree sometimes to try to distill this approach down. So, is there any kind of practical kind of suggestions you'd have just off the cuff to not go down that PR marketing route?
Yeah,
and have it really, really authentic.
Yeah, well, the first we've kind of touched on, which is take the approach of clarifying, not creating. So,
yes.
In the process of clarifying purpose, turn up the volume, give everyone in the organization at least the opportunity to have a voice, make sure customer voice is represented, make sure that, to your point, you get as wide a lens as you can across any stakeholder that's important to your company, and look for a stimulus both within your industry and out with your industry. So that's the first thing. The second thing is then what's done with it afterwards. So, often previous, historical approaches would be some sort of poster or manifesto or, at the most creative, maybe a desktop background or something like that.
Yeah, we've seen a few of those.
Exactly. So there's a few things I would say. One, yes, it's important to have shareable assets. So you want to get the actual narrative out and front of mind and in people's hands, but do that in a way that is instilling symbolism in things that your people in your company, employees, maybe customers will actually use. So, for example, we did some work with Dimmocks, and they got elements of their purpose articulated on bookmarks and book bags, tote bags, and stuff like that. So things that people actually value, actually use, and doesn't mean that you need to write all the statements on that. Give some thought to how creatively you're going to bring the purpose to life on those things. That's one, but it also shouldn't stop there. It should also then, your purpose should be codified and used to inform your layers of strategic decision making. So, whatever strategic model you use, 3 to 5 year strategic plan, annual strategic review, any strategic decisions that need to be made in the organization, it's important that purpose is codified and used in that process and represented as a criteria in strategic decision making, so that the actions of the organization actually start to reflect what the purpose says. And that's probably the most critical bit long term, to turn words into action. Ultimately the PR piece is words, but that's just the start of the journey.
Yeah, and all the stuff pre to that you've talked about, clarified, not created. That really speaks to me, that if something is created and then slapped up on the wall on it and on all sorts of kind of stuff, that probably does more damage in my experience. People look at it and they say, well, I wasn't part of this. I wasn't consulted. Beautifully, shaped words and phrases.
Yeah.
But to your point, if you've done the clarification part before that, that to me changes the whole thing.
Exactly. That's probably the critical bit. But then, of course, you're in a fairly precarious position then, because you've created this excitement, you created this buy-in. If strategic actions beyond that then are misaligned to that, you've created your own problem.
So true.
So you need to be, as an organization, committed to not only engaging everyone and clarifying, you need to then be willing to give it strategic credence. It needs to be given credibility at a strategic level. Otherwise, the whole exercise could actually be more damaging than helpful. Absolutely.
Exactly the same principles as you've probably heard me bang on about with, an open strategy. If you open it up and have the conversation and then people are acknowledged, but they don't see any traceability at all with the end result and the impact, then it can be nearly worse, can't it? Because people start to question integrity. Was this just a stunt? Yeah.
There's actually a really interesting piece of research the last couple of years by Michelle McQuaid, actually a Melbourne researcher, positive psychology expert, and she found that whereas we might think that not asking for the opinion of employees might be the most damaging thing, actually that comes second to asking for people's opinion and then going in a different direction without explanation.
Interesting.
So really interesting study to look up.
It is, yeah. We can put that in the show notes. In terms of, you mentioned that, the term codified, and that rings true. At the same time, I've in other organisations, the formal stuff and the codification, and I've also heard you talk about, it's also those informal conversations as well, and that's what we see.
Mm-hmm.
So people, I think, staff from whatever level are becoming so much more in tune with what leadership does, the tone from the top. So if there's the big statements out there, but the leadership team right up to the board, if they're not displaying the behaviours and the link to the values as well, and if it's not embedded in the day-to-day conversations, let's call them informal conversations, it can start to lose its impact as well. From what I observe, is that true to what you see?
Yeah. So when I talk about purpose giving kind of directionality to strategy, culture, and brand, I would probably have that in that culture bucket. So it kind of gives direction to the way we are as a company, and clearly leadership and role modeling is a huge part of that. And actually, there's a really interesting theory in positive psychology of meaningfulness at work, and purpose comes up quite a lot in this theory. It's called there's two parts to it: karma, inspire. But basically, karma is an acronym for how organizations can instill meaning in work for their employees.
Right.
And part of that, the C is clarity, which is basically being clear on what the bigger purpose is, which is what we talked about so far. But there's also A is for authenticity, which is how do leaders turn up and role model the elements of that purpose. It's such a critical piece. And mattering is the M in karma model, and that basically is how are leaders connecting that day-to-day actions of employees to that bigger picture. So those are the bits that start to instill the purpose in the day-to-day culture of the organization. So usually I would talk about that as a separate theoretical bucket to the strategy piece, which is a much more kind of structured. How do we make sure that the purpose is represented in strategic decisions that happen?
I see. Yeah, that's a good practical thing to call out. Then, if you look at the ongoing, I've seen different ways you can then measure purpose, and when you look at strategy, sometimes it is tougher to measure those big, bold, strategic directions, and then you could say it's also tough to measure purpose and then the impact. So, can you talk to us a bit about, in terms of how you see, people can start to measure to some degree the impact of purpose, both in the organisations and then externally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I guess that would come down to, again, what element of measurement are we talking about? So, in our strategic plan, we should clearly have kind of indicators for how well we're executing on that. So, as long as purpose has been effectively codified into strategic decisions and is represented in the strategic plan, then measuring the effectiveness of the implementation of the strategy would be one way of measuring the effectiveness on the purpose. When we talk about purpose being instilled in culture, it's about understanding and hearing the voice of employees and how they feel, how well they feel the company is acting in accordance with the purpose. And then when we talk about the brand piece, it's how aligned is the market's perception of the company to what we would want it to be based on the purpose. So depending on which of those buckets, those three buckets we're talking about, they would be measured in slightly different ways. But fundamentally, what it boils down to is that at regular intervals, a company wants to know what the perception of their employees and customers is. And that's that kind of, we said right back at the start, we're passionate about bringing employee and customer voice into the boardroom. It's really important that an executive team and a board understand as regularly as possible what the sentiment towards the company is amongst employees, customers, shareholders, stakeholders, and doing that in a way that sheds light onto how they are perceived to be delivering on elements of purpose is kind of at a high level how we want to understand its effectiveness.
Yeah, I think it's a good call out, because So often, say in the strategy space, we'll say, how in tune are you with your external, branding and perspectives and insights? And, a lot of people, could say, we've got the third party doing the research, we've got the surveys, we've got the data, which is all obviously hugely important. But then when you ask how in touch are you really to the street, close to the street are you to those actual live insights, right from a board point of view and executive, and it even perhaps leads back to governance from a board, from what we see in certain industries, because if some of the board aren't having some direct conversations with the broader market and even some of the customers, it's very hard to tune into the real, even from a governance and risk point of view, of what's really happening. And that kind of maps back to what you're talking about there.
Yeah, and you mentioned something there earlier. They'll say that they have the data, which is true, but I think one of the problems with big data and with everything that we can know these days is that I mentioned it earlier, almost every exec we talk to is sitting on a couple of 150-page reports telling them everything they could possibly know about the customers and employees. But we're getting to the stage now where they also they say nothing. They say so much that really within that is not any insight in terms of what matters most to different customer and employee groups. So it's very hard to actually make decisions based on that. And of course, when you start having a complex stakeholder environment at board and exec level, any individual on those teams could look at that report and pull something else that they think is most important out of it. So it actually starts to cause misalignment, particularly when different pieces of research have been commissioned by different parts of the business.
And what's the intent behind the research? And
totally. So what we really advocate for is an executive sponsored, and I mean a team level piece of research. So they're all commissioning it together. They all have input into what it's asking, and therefore it can be conducted in a way that is very targeted, pulls very specific insights around what the team want to know, and then obviously aligns the team around the things that are most important to those that are most important to them at that time.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Certainly agree with that. Now we're just going to switch to it's a new segment we've got in the show, a bit of a funner segment. It's Friday afternoon. So with your help, we're calling this the rapid fire round, as I mentioned before. So this is 10 questions, ideally one-word answers if we can.
Okay.
So it's the intention is really to try to distill it down and just get your immediate response. So we've got kind of four funner ones up front, and then we dig a bit deeper in terms of the actual theme of the topic.
Okay.
So let's kick it off. So these are the 10 rapid fire round questions. So Ross, your favourite food?
One word.
It's tough, isn't it? You can say McDonald's or...
Let's go Thai.
Thai. There you go. Good choice. Favourite holiday destination?
Banff.
Banff, beautiful. Beautiful skiing there. I know you're a ski instructor, so I'm sure you've spent a bit of time there. What was your very first job?
Paper round.
Paper round.
I'll hyphenate it.
Fantastic. Back in the day, hey, we're getting to the age now where
That's right.
where we can say that. Now we're getting to the bit more interesting ones. So describe yourself in one word.
Optimistic.
Beautiful. Now, in terms of the kind of blending in with the topic we're talking about, one word, what is purpose?
Direction.
Now, what's your own personal purpose?
In one word.
One word. Not easy.
Difference.
Nice. Now, a bit of a different take on this. What isn't purpose in one word? Thinking long and hard.
I'm going to hyphenate again. Tagline.
Yeah, good perspective. Three more. This one's a bit of a weird one. What are you scared of?
Injections.
Yeah, cool. What's not important to you?
Fame.
There you go. And the last one, bit of a quirky one to finish on. What defines happiness for you, Ross? In one word.
growth.
Beautiful. Fantastic. Well, thanks for bearing with us there, Ross. You're our first rapid fire round Q&A.
That's great.
So
That's fun.
it's interesting, isn't it? You know, when you're trying to distill things down to one word, as Claire and I were writing these up earlier, we're having a bit of fun with it. So thanks for bearing with us there.
I had to count out many foods that had more than one word in them.
Yeah, I can imagine all those bad foods are flying through your mind
Fish
as well.
and chips, yeah,
That's right. What are you having on Friday or Saturday night? Very good. So to finish it off, just a couple of questions. In terms of looping back to probably a bit of the impact side of things, and if we look at purpose, if I play devil's advocate, there are executives and organisations out there that would perhaps say, you know, why would I bother with purpose? Its purpose can be, if we ignored some of the stuff we talked about, can be this fluffy thing that I have to spend far too much time talking about. It's a bit of a waste of time, and I can't see the impact.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any? You know, I'm sure you have some of those conversations. You know, how do you normally respond to that, and what do you try to point to?
I would probably ask. I'd probably ask a short handful of questions, I guess, in response to that. One would be, how aligned are your executive team? I.e., whenever a decision needs to be made, how aligned are they on their perspective of what matters most, and how effectively and efficiently can you make decisions as an executive team? And I guess a follow-on to that question is, how many strategic initiatives are in your strategic plan? Because if it's more than, you know, that core 3 or 5, in our experience, they just don't all get delivered on. So you end up delivering on the path of least resistance as opposed to the things that matter most. And there's a great Warren Buffett story. I'm sure it's an apocryphal tale, but this whole idea of, you know, his one piece of advice would be, write down the 10 things that are most important to do in your business, and then cross out 4 to 10 because they are so dangerous. They're the ones worthy of being on your top 10, but they're not in your top 3. So all they're going to do is distract attention from what matters most. So it's a very long first question that I would ask them, but that ultimately,
it's practical.
You know, how aligned are you, right? And you know, connected to that, how focused are you strategically? How effectively does your company organize change? So when you do implement new strategic initiatives, how effectively are they implemented, executed, carried out by the team? How are they bought into by the team and by everyone in your organization? Because if that's not going smoothly, purpose would help. How confident are you that you know what matters most to your customers? How confident are you that you know what matters most to your employees? And you know, how effectively does your company proactively navigate change? So how effectively does your company innovate what it does? So these are the things that I would say that purpose has a kind of a disproportionate impact on. We're seeing that purpose-driven organizations now are attracting and retaining more of the right customers. They're attracting and retaining the right employees, which is becoming increasingly important in a challenging labor market.
Yeah, it certainly is.
They're achieving up to triple growth compared to their industry peers, and they're innovating more effectively, more in a more focused way, and more rapidly. So, you know, of course, if an exec came back to me and said that they are performing very well in all those areas and respond positively to all those questions, I would suggest that they're either lying or they have in some way instilled purpose in their organization without realizing it, if that makes sense. So sometimes, you know, sometimes in particularly smaller organizations,
that's really fascinating.
You'll have a really charismatic founder who's still very active in the business. And of course, they become the living, walking purpose framework. They inform the culture, they inform the brand, they inform the strategy. And in that case, I would say, yeah, sure, there's probably no point in going through the process of articulating this and writing it down, because you have a human that is fulfilling that function. It's part of the reason that we don't do a lot of work for companies smaller than, say, 200 employees, because often they don't have such a pressing need for an articulated purpose framework. I have never come across an organization with more than 200 people where that purpose, that function is served by an individual. You might say that a company like Virgin, with someone incredibly charismatic like a Richard Branson, up till quite an advanced stage in their growth, they might have got away with that through him. He is their purpose framework.
True, and he probably did in the early days.
Probably did, but even them, even they are actually a really good example of a great purpose, well-articulated purpose framework now.
Right.
So even they have gone through the process of codifying Richard Branson and everything that he is into a clearly articulated set of statements and a narrative.
Yeah, I think that's really practical. The path of least resistance you mentioned there in the Warren Buffett story, and so often it has been, it can be, let's just choose that thing we can get done, and kind of tick off without really facing into the kind of the big kind of meaty decisions that we have to do.
Exactly.
And I've from a strategy point of view, I'm sure you've heard it. It's not unique, but we refer to it. Some people say, "Oh, we don't really have a strategy written down as such." Well, everyone does have a strategy because they've made certain decisions along the way.
And they do things. Yeah.
Exactly. It's what they're doing really is really the ultimate, and then the impact, of course, the ultimate test. So to finish on, in terms of a question to finish on, just more contextualised to the times, as we're heading into 2023. I think we're going to be facing, we've kind of, people are talking about that we've got through the pandemic in theory, which is an interesting way to put it, isn't it? But as we go into 2023, there is quite a bit of uncertainty and ambiguity, a topic we've talked on in the past as well. And, some of the traditional conventional numbers are not adding up, even from an economic point of view. We're coming, from a not-for-profit and for-purpose point of view, some government funding is starting to dry up. Organisations are really having to lean in to look at how can they bring more sustainable revenue streams onto there. So if we contextualise that question of when we look at purpose and leading into strategy of what you're seeing into 2023, and that can be how to respond to that or simply what you're seeing, I think it'd be a nice way to finish for our audience to hear that. So it's more contextualised to the times, the stuff we're talking about. What's your view on, what does 2023 look like from an economy, from a market and society perspective, and how can leaders look at that in the context of purpose?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And my mind immediately goes to the labour market. And without exception, every single exec I talk to at the moment is struggling with this. This challenge that it is becoming harder and harder to attract and retain the right employees. There's upward pressure on salaries. It's a really challenging space out there. And the narrative up to this point has been around the Great Resignation that has started and is carrying on and will carry on, I think, into 2023, except I have fundamentally disagree with this concept of the Great Resignation because not everybody is retiring early or pursuing their newfound sourdough baking passion.
Yes.
So what are they actually doing? Well, it's probably just a sign of a far more autonomous, enabled, transient labour market that is far more aware of their options, far more attuned to the opportunities that are available to them, and probably have readjusted their priorities in life based on the big shock of the last couple of years. So I prefer to look at it. Our vision at Nilo is a future where companies compete primarily on the positive impact they can have on people's lives, right? So I say that because I am biased in terms of what I'm about to say, but I really hope what we're seeing is a great migration where employees are basically going to move from employers that don't provide a great experience, don't give them meaning, don't help them realize how their day-to-day actions and their careers matter, and move to organizations that do provide that bigger picture to connect their actions to, do give them meaning in what they do, and do make them realize that what they're doing with their lives and in their careers matter. And it kind of comes back to one of your questions earlier in terms of purpose matching. In an ideal world, an organization can give someone purpose in their life. Like you said, not many of us walk around knowing what our purpose is, and we might have multiple purposes in different contexts.
True.
But a great thing that an organization can do is actually, give their people purpose in life, make them feel like what they're doing with more than 50% of their time when they're at work actually fundamentally means something. And I really hope we're seeing, going into 2023, the best talent moving from the companies that don't do a good job with that to the companies that do. And again, that would mean that having a clear purpose becomes more and more important.
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant picture you painted there, and I would have to agree that the stats by 2025 is that 75% of the workforce are going to be millennials. I think you talked about the generational shift. It's, to be blunt, it's forcing some of this, the older, not older in age, but the older mindsets, and you can be any age with an older or newer mindset. I think it's kind of forcing that change to a degree.
Yeah.
So I think you've summed that up, really in a helpful light, because I think that is the number one challenge at the moment, and you don't see it kind of fading, do you? So
no, and I would just say that particularly when we talk about millennials, I mentioned earlier that companies who are seen as purposeful, purpose-driven, or having a purpose are perceived to be so, are attracting and retaining customers and consumers, are attracting and retaining the right employees, are growing faster, and they're innovating more effectively. If we narrow that subset to millennials only, those results are even more profound.
Right.
So to your point, that millennial focus is huge, and for an organization to be successful there is not about employee benefits. It's not about pay. It's not about their flexible working agreement. It's not
slides
about
and pool tables and
fruit bowls, blah blah blah.
Yeah.
I mean, these things are kind of rational benefits and rational part of an employee value proposition. They need to be there, but they are just a foundation, and they should just, all that matters from a kind of motivation perspective is that the rational stuff is seen as fair and equitable. You don't want to, an individual doesn't want to feel undervalued in that sense and feel like their equivalents elsewhere are getting more for the same thing. But
True.
Once that's in place, it's actually the biggest thing you can do in terms of providing an astonishing employee experience is give your employees meaning and make their work matter. That, like, fundamentally, that's where the bar should be set.
Yeah, I think it's very nicely articulated. Well, Ross, it's been wonderful to chat. I know we chat every now and then, but it's not until you're in front of a microphone with a specific topic and kind of distilling it down, you get some really, really interesting insights, and we've got those today. So thank you again. We'll put your details, Nilo's details and your own details in the show notes. So
Great.
If you want to hear more about what Ross is talking about, what he does personally and in the organisation, have a look at that. And we'll hopefully do this again soon.
I'd love to, and thank you for the really great questions. I think it makes a difference with things like these, and I really enjoyed them. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ross. Cheers.
Cheers.